Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Every league, during the second week, I tend to put together a video outlining the way the trade league meta is shaping up. However, this league, I want to revisit it because there's been a lot of changes. So we're currently in the 5th week of the Mercenaries League, and everything is looking very new. This video, I want to go through the trade league meta, how it's evolved, some of the biggest changes to earlier on, and also have a look at some builds that might give you inspiration if you're looking to roll up a new ult. Now, this is a follow-up to the day 13 version of this video. Whilst you could technically watch them in either order, I am going to assume that you've already watched the first one. So I'll put a link to it down in the description below. If you do find that there's bits that are difficult to follow because I'm skipping over things, then maybe have a look at that one first. I'm not going to explain things in quite as much detail in this version of the video. However, one of the really interesting things is that build diversity is up. Quite a lot, actually, over the day 13 meta. And this is kind of unusual. We'll have a look through this, and we'll also have a look at something I haven't considered much in the previous versions of this video, which is how things are performing on a budget versus how things are performing when you can throw a lot of currency at them. Now, there's a whole lot on methodology I'd go through in the first video. If you haven't seen the day 13 video, I just recommend pausing now and having a quick read of the notes that I've got here. But like I mentioned, I want to dig into the question of high and low budget builds and which ascendancies in particular are doing better at higher budgets, which ones are viable at all sorts of budgets. Now, it's a little bit difficult to come to an exact definition of what is a budget build and what isn't. But one thing that I think clearly identifies that a build is not viable on a budget is if a character is equipping any of the following items: Nimbus, Mageblood, Progenesis, Svalin, or the Celestial Brace. All of these items are 50 divines or more. Nimbus is actually a little bit under 50, but it's pretty close to that bracket. And additionally, Nimbus tends to go alongside other more expensive items. And as a result, I'm going to be counting anything that has one of those items or more equipped as being a non-budget build. Anything that doesn't use any of those 5 items, I'm tentatively calling it a budget build. This is sometimes going to result in a little bit of confusion around the edges, but generally speaking, this is the best that you can do when you're dealing with large numbers of characters, rather than just dealing with a very small number. One thing that was raised with me as a way that you can potentially track down builds that are expensive but that don't look it because they're not using any individually expensive unique item is builds that have mirrored items equipped. The reason I'm not filtering these out is because you can have items in jewelry slots that are quite budget friendly and that happen to be mirrored. So we're not talking about things that are being created through the use of a Mirror of Kalandra on an item here. We're talking about things that have been pulled out of in-map reflecting mist events or from Guff's research bench. These tend to produce reasonably cheap items that are mirrored, and sometimes these can be quite good. I know that in patch 3.25, I got a 1 divine amulet that someone had pulled out of a reflecting mist, and it was something that I used for a long period of time on my league starter, and I was quite happy with it. It just had a large amount of dot multi, had a large amount of chaos resistance, had a moderate amount of intelligence. Every other stat on it was negative, but the overall package was good enough that I was happy to use that. So that was a budget item, and there's a number of items that are reflected pieces of jewelry that are budget friendly. I don't want to block those out. Now, you could block out everyone that is using a mirrored weapon or a mirrored armor piece, and I did consider doing that, but the number of those is just too small to consider. And that's because people that are electing to use a mirror tier weapon or a mirror tier armor piece, they are almost certainly already wearing Mageblood and have been for quite some time. Likewise, if their build wants Svalin, they're using Svalin. If their build wants Progenesis, they're using Progenesis, and so on and so forth. Now, if you get inspired by any of the builds that are here, and you happen to be watching this video when it's pretty new, I wanted to plug a player run event. This is not some sort of paid ad or anything of the sort. This is something I'm doing because I enjoy the event. This is BPL. It's a private league event that was originally set up by streamer This Is Badger. This Is Badger now works for Grinding Gear Games in audio design, and so he's passed the torch on to other people. But this is something that's going to be running the weekend after I post this video. BPL runs for 72 hours. I only recommend it if you can play a lot and also be present in Discord chat quite a lot during that 72-hour period. So wouldn't recommend this if you work weekends. I also wouldn't recommend it if you work 9 to 5 and you've got children and the only time you really get to spend with your family is on the weekend. But if you're not in one of those situations, then BPL is a lot of fun, and I'll put a link down in the description below if you want to find out more about that event. Now, I want to quickly talk about one of the things that's had a big factor on what builds are considered good. And this is the reason that the build that has taken over as number 1, replacing the Slams build, has shot up so much. And this is Cartography Scarab of Risk. This Scarab was gigabuffed in 3.26, and it's been catapulted into a position where it adds more loot than anything else that you can do with your Scarab slots on maps, but at the same time, it's not one of the crazy rare Scarabs either. This Scarab in its new form would have been really good even before Tier 16.5 maps existed, but now that Tier 16.5 maps exist alongside Tier 17 maps, it's even better. So farming these was starting to get popular at the time that I was writing and researching the Day 13 video, but it hadn't really impacted the meta so much. This is going to be the reason that you're going to see Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice using the new Whispers of Infinity amulet at the top of the list now, whereas on the Day 13 version, it was much lower down the list. Cartography Scarab of Risk farming is just that good. I also want to mention, while we're on the topic of unique items, and we'll come back to this right at the end, unique item use across the board was really low on Day 13. People were going for rares instead. This has turned a corner. This is no longer the case, and now we're starting to see a lot more unique items getting used. Whispers of Infinity is the biggest breakout item. It's relatively common. It's the most common drop from one of the new Pinnacle bosses, but on top of that, it's not being used as a budget substitute. It's forever gear when it's being used. You'll find, for instance, that Whispers of Infinity is actually more popular on players that have equipped Mage Blood than it is on players that haven't equipped Mage Blood. Now, there were 2 items that were made much more common in patch 3.26 with no fanfare: Crystallized Omniscience and Grace the Goddess. These are starting to tick up in use now that players have started to realize, oh yeah, these are pretty accessible now, whereas in the past, they were kind of crazy hard to get. Now, if you want to build around one of these items, you definitely can. Definitely consider it if you're interested in rolling an alt. These items are not common, but Trade League is big enough that there's plenty of them in circulation, and the amount in circulation exceeds the amount of demand for them, so they're pretty cheap now. I'm also going to talk about Doryani Mercenaries a bit in this video. What this means is that your mercenary is wearing the unique chess piece Doryani's prototype. As well as this, your mercenary is investing as much as possible into negative lightning resistance on gear, which can go as low as negative 200%. You can use this with or without the unique chess piece, the Admiral. Now, if you're using the Admiral, that has to be on your character, whereas your mercenary is wearing Doryani's prototype. The Admiral allows your cold and fire damage to attack your enemy's lightning resistance instead, as long as the lightning resistance is lower. And in these sorts of circumstances, it will be. Note that with the Admiral, this is only going to apply for instant application or hit damage. It will not apply to damage over time. So let's have a look firstly at the Ascendancy Split. Now, we're going to break this down a little bit. We're going to look at it for all builds. We're going to look at it for budget builds. We're going to look at it explicitly for non-budget builds. And then we're going to smash all 3 of those charts together into one. So here's what the Ascendancy Split looks like when we consider all budgets, high and low. You'll see Trickster first, Chieftain, Occultist, Elementalist, Berserker, Necromancer, Slayer. It's quite a drop down to Slayer there. And then we have Deadeye, Hierophant, Inquisitor, Pathfinder, Ascendant, Juggernaut, and Champion, rounding out the average size slices. Then we have the small slices, Warden, Gladiator, Guardian, and Saboteur. And then we have the tiny slice. Yep, poor little Assassin. Assassin's actually not completely terrible, but it just tends to be the case that it's not the best at anything. And so people look at it and go, hey, I could play Inquisitor or Assassin for this. Inquisitor is 4% better, I'm going Inquisitor. Or they look at something and go, hey, I could play this as an Assassin or a Pathfinder, but Pathfinder is 8% better, so I'm going Pathfinder instead. That's the situation with Assassin. It's not all that far behind, but it is definitely behind on pretty much everything. So what happens when we look at the expensive setup? Ooh, gee, those Tricksters are looking a bit more common now, aren't they? Then we have Chieftain, Occultist, Elementalist, Berserker. Berserker here you'll see is a much smaller slice than it was before, and then a similar sort of pattern going down. What about when we only look at budget? And you'll see the Tricksters, they're in a smaller slice this time. Chieftains, much bigger. Occultist, Elementalist, Berserker, Necromancer, Slayer. Berserker, again, doing really well on a budget, but then once people get rich, they tend to respec out of it. So what about when we smash all 3 of these together? Now, the innermost ring here, that is the budget builds. The expensive builds are on the outermost ring, and then all builds are in the middle. This should give you a bit of a visualization as to how popular each Ascendancy is at a range of budgets. So low budget, high budget, and whatever, considering every single player that is level 96 or above. So the biggest takeaway here is that Occultist is by far the biggest winner since the Day 13 meta video. The Whispers of Infinity Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice build, that is now the top build of the league, that was just gaining traction back then, but it has absolutely shot up since. It's mostly played as a power charge stacking Occultist that is dealing instant application critical strike damage, but that is not the only way that you can play it. Trickster is surge forward too, but I do want to caution you, Trickster is only surging forward amongst players that have got a lot of currency to throw into their build. I would not recommend Trickster unless you've already got Mage Blood and you've still got quite a bit of currency left over afterwards. Most of these gains are coming at Berserker's expense. So people started out the league with a Berserker, they got bored with it, and then they re-rolled as something else. The Berserker Ascendancy is in freefall now. This doesn't mean that people were wrong to play it though. People are just moving on. It's probably still the single best Ascendancy in the game for going from level 1 up to 4 Void Stones plus 5 Scarab slots plus 120 Atlas bonus. It is probably still the case that Berserker is best to get you that far. But once you are that far, then it's not quite so hot anymore. Then you can start to move on to something else. The wealthier you are in League, the better Trickster gets. This is the one spot where I did dig a little bit into who is using mirrored weapons, who is using mirrored armor pieces, and amongst people that are equipping 2 or more pieces of mirrored gear. And we're not counting jewelry here because jewelry can be something that comes from another source like the in-map reflecting mist events. But if we're talking about real mirrored items that have probably been created through the use of a Mirror of Kalandra, Trickster is an absolute majority of all of the characters that have got 2 or more pieces of mirrored gear on their character. Let me be clear about that. When I say absolute majority, I don't just mean a plurality. I don't just mean that it's the most common individual slice. I'm talking about it has more than 50% of the pie itself. Now, the Elementalist buffs are substantial, and basically every single player that is playing Elementalist is using the Golem package. The Golem package got huge buffs. It is the case that the Elementalist took another nerf in order to offset those buffs, but the Elementalist as a whole package is still better. So Shaper of Flame is worse than it was in 3.25, but the buffs that have been made to the Golem section of the Elementalist are so substantial that overall it comes out ahead. Now I want to take an extensive look at build diversity through the prism of skill use. Here, I'll mention the current meta share, but also what it was on day 13, so you can have a look at the changes because they're quite often very substantial. In a couple of cases, I'll also look at earlier snapshots as well, so day 3 and day 5. That's going to be when we're looking at the Berserker Slam builds, because that will really tell a story as to how brightly that build burnt and also how quickly it burnt itself out. I'm going to present these in the order of how successful they were back on day 13. So I haven't reordered them, and that's deliberate. You'll be able to reorder them yourself if you want. And then at the end of all the builds that had 3% or more of the meta back on day 13, we'll then go through the ones that have 3% or more now, but that weren't 3% back on day 13. So firstly, we have Volcanic Fissure of Snaking. This is the Berserker Slam build, and this is 7% of the meta, or 8% if you count all of the Slam builds. So the way that I can identify that you're playing a Slam build is because you've got Seismic Cry somewhere in your build. This was 18% of the meta back on day 13. It was 28% of the meta on day 5. It was 29% of the meta on day 3. So it's kind of in freefall at the moment. There is a related Earthshatter build, that's the other popular Slam build. It's less popular by quite a bit than Volcanic Fissure of Snaking, but once you factor that in, you're looking at 8% of the current meta. Why is this so popular? It's popular because it had excellent guides. It's popular because it gets strong enough to take down non-Uber versions of Pinnacle bosses on really, really bad gear. Probably on worse gear than anything else that exists in the entirety of the league. It can also limp through tier 17, so we're not talking speed clearing tier 17s without reading the mods. We're talking get to the end of the tier 17 before the portals run out, and limp through tier 17s on pretty bad gear on this as well. But getting it to the point that it can crush tier 17s, that takes a lot more investment. Ultimately, it's a fairly polarizing playstyle, and that's one of the reasons I think that it's fallen off pretty hard since. Volcanic Fissure of Snaking has automatic aiming on it. This is why it takes the cake over other slams, even though some of the other slams can do more damage. You don't need to accurately target, you just need to fire it off. The other thing you can do with Volcanic Fissure of Snek is you can preload a bunch of them when you know that a boss is going to spawn at a certain time. However, this is one of those builds that is not that popular to play, and also it does tend to fall off once you start transitioning away from limping through your first tier 17 of the league up to trying to do Gigajuice tier 16.5s or Gigajuice tier 17s. At that point, it can be made to work, but it's something that tends to require more than other builds do, and so lots of people are transitioning out of it. Second place early in the league was Righteous Fire. Now, this one is kind of tricky to categorize because there's actually a bit of overlap with Cast When Stunned Chieftains. We'll come to that in a sec. Righteous Fire is now 6% of the meta. It was 7% back on day 13. This build is played more than its power level would indicate, and that's because it's a very simple, very satisfying playstyle. You charge into a pack of weak enemies, you burn them down a little bit, explode one of them, and then once that monster explodes, it ignites the tougher monsters that are around it. That explosion was dealing tremendous damage because it's the Chieftain Hinekora explosions, and then you propagate that throughout the pack, whether that be with traditional Ignite proliferation mechanics, whether it be the pseudo-proliferation that's found on Beric's Respite, any of those sorts of mechanics, all fun stuff, that then propagates through the entire pack and spreads the love, spreads the warmth across the entire screen. The explosions sound fantastic. That's another reason that I think this build is really popular, more so than its power level would indicate. This skill is probably the weakest boss killing skill that's on this list, but that doesn't really matter very much in the context of Trade League. You don't farm bosses multiple times very often. You do them once, then you move on, unless you've got a specialized character, in which case you trade for tokens from other people, and then you run those on repeat. In exchange for this manageable weakness of being bad against bosses, you're the best build in the league at clearing a lot of different mechanics. Expedition, Breach, Abyss, you're really, really good at all of these. Add in a popular playstyle, great guides, and that's the popularity here. Now this can be played on non-Chieftain Ascendancies, but Chieftain does tend to take the cake, and that's because of those Hinekora explosions. Now there are a number of people that will start Righteous Fire and then will later transition out of Righteous Fire into Cast When Stunned Chieftain builds. It's also worth noting that 1/3 of Righteous Fire builds are also using Cast When Stunned linked to Detonate Dead of Scavenging in their build. And that I would say is one of the things that categorizes a Cast When Stunned Chieftain build. The line between the two is blurry. I'm calling your build a Righteous Fire build if it meets one of these conditions. Either you use a 5+ link Fire Trap and you use Righteous Fire at all in your build, or secondly, you have a 5+ link Righteous Fire. If you meet either of those conditions, I'm calling you a Righteous Fire build and counting you here, but you might also end up getting counted in the Cast When Stunned Chieftain section. The next build back on day 13 was Smite of Divine Judgement. This one has actually gone up in use since then. It's now being played by 6% of the player base, up from 4%. So this has mostly replaced the post-nerf Frostblades of Catabasis and Lightning Strike builds. It's the preeminent Slayer Critical Strike build. However, there is also a newer Trickster version of this. Trickster lacked damage on this skill last league, but it had incredible defenses. However, if you're dealing lightning damage, you know what the solution is to not dealing enough damage. It's a Doryani Merc. Smite of Divine Judgement Trickster alongside a Doryani Merc can do really, really scary damage, whilst also just being able to tank pretty much anything in the game. And next we have the Blink Arrow Mirror Arrow builds. Now we're going to get into a section where we're going to be talking about minion builds here. Blink Arrow Mirror Arrow was 4% of the meta and is now 2% of the meta. This uses Transfigured Blink Arrow and Transfigured Mirror Arrow gems, not really for the movement, but primarily for the minions that they leave behind. It scales the damage of those minions. It's usually played on the Necromancer, but it can be played as a Guardian or a Pathfinder. Each of these scales their damage in quite different ways. Now this one's down quite a bit from day 13, but it's still quite a popular choice. However, in the day 13 video, I didn't cover raised Spectre builds. They didn't meet the 3% threshold. They didn't miss by all that much, but they weren't able to get over the line. Well, Spectres have actually replaced BAMA as the preeminent minion build. There is also an Animate Guardian build as well. Now, the confusing thing here is that these three builds actually overlap quite a lot. So if you have a look, for instance, at the Blink Arrow Mirror Arrow builds, you'll see that actually fully something like 30 or 40% of them are also Spectre builds. And likewise, if you look at the Spectre builds, some significant percentage of them are also BAMA builds. So a whole lot of different setups there. So it's hard to specify whether certain builds are BAMA or whether they're Animate Guardian or whether they're a Spectre one. Ultimately though, all three of these are reasonable builds. And if you wanted to put them all together, then collectively they'd be something like 6% of the meta. Next up we have Kinetic Blast. This one has shot up. This was only 4% of the meta before, it's now 7%. Now this is played as a Warden or a Deadeye originally, but also as a Trickster quite recently. That's sort of taken off. This makes direct attacks with wands, no mines are involved. This is not like the Power Siphon mine builds of last league. Typically this uses Sacred Wisp support. Earlier in the league it was mostly using Trinity support, but Trinity support is mostly gone now. The reason for that is that Doryani mercs are just simply stronger, and they strongly incentivize you to be dealing primarily lightning damage. Now that doesn't mean that Trinity support is unplayable. It's still viable, it's still being used by a bunch of people, but it's no longer something that is nearly universally being used. Grace of the Goddess is popular on the Warden versions now. It's much more affordable than it's been in the past, so if you are interested in rolling up on the Warden versions, then that's an option that you can go with. Or alternately, you can force it into a Deadeye, or you can force it into a Trickster setup as well. It's a good item all around, but it's something that seems to be more popular on the Warden versions than anything else. Next we have the Castle Wind Stun Chieftain. This is up to 7% from 4% on day 13. Now this captures a lot of things that people like about the Righteous Fire Chieftain, but a more explosive package. Can become very tanky, can scale damage extremely high, but it is really bad when dealing with solo bosses where it can really struggle a lot. And some builds are actually double counted. They're going to be counted as a Righteous Fire build and also as a Castle Wind Stun Chieftain. That's unfortunate, but it's not something where you can draw a clear line of demarcation without confusing the issue a bit. Next we have something that has completely fallen off the radar, Poisonous Concoction of Bouncing. This was 3%, so it did make it into the day 13 video. I'm mentioning it here because it was in the day 13 video, not because it deserves to be anymore. 0.9% play rate now. It's still very playable, but it's very much something people play early on, and then once they've got their Void Stones, they're like, yep, Poisonous Conch of Bouncing, you're retired. I'm going to transition over into the build that I actually want to play because you have done everything I need you to do. Next up is Penance Brand of Dissipation. This is being played by 4% now, up from 3% back on day 13. There's a top tier boss killing skill, it's top tier in the Sanctum, and it has a few other things that it's really good at. This can be played on a lot of different ascendancies, and it's almost always played with critical strike setups. Now, 2 of the 62 absolute legends out there that are using the ultra rare Runegraft of the Angler, fair warning, this thing costs a good percentage of a mirror, they are playing Penance Brand of Dissipation as their primary skill. So it is definitely something that has some cool top-end toys as well, but for most people, it's viable without the Runegraft of the Angler, because chances are you will never see that thing. Cyclone is next. This is up to 5% from 3%, but really this is 4 builds smushed into one category. We have Cast when channeling Cyclone, we have Cast on Critical Strike Cyclone, we have Cyclone physical damage using Shockwave support, and we have Cyclone dealing instant application damage that is not using Shockwave support. All of these are viable builds, but they're all very different to each other. Anyway, the one that's shot up in popularity the most is the Cast on Critical Strike version. And many of these fall into 2 categories here. They are Cyclone builds, but they are also Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice builds. Here we have the new build of the league. This has replaced Volcanic Fissure of Snaking as a top skill that's being used by high-level characters. It has absolutely exploded in popularity. Depending on the way you round it, it's either 9% or 10% of budget builds and 9 or 10% of all builds, and it's basically one of the top performers of the entire league. Central to this build is the new unique item, Whispers of Infinity. This is the common drop from one of the new pinnacle bosses. So we're not talking about something that's hard to get here. This is something that has a slightly under 50% drop rate, and it allows this powerful spell to be used in conjunction with Chaos Inoculation to completely bypass its inherent drawbacks. The reason Whispers of Infinity does this is that Chaos Inoculation sets your maximum life to 1, which renders any life cost that is greater than 0 completely unable to be paid. However, Whispers of Infinity transfers that life cost into a different cost, one that your character is capable of paying, and that means that you can cast this skill. Whereas without Whispers of Infinity, you're not going to be able to cast a 6-link Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice on most builds at all. Now this is often played as a power charge stacking, instant application damage critical strike occultist, but that is not the only way that you can scale damage on it. Coiling Whisper is another interesting item that's often used in this setup, but I want to caution you, if you're thinking of using Coiling Whisper on the build, make sure you research its mechanics extensively. Coiling Whisper may require you to use a very specific gem level on Hex Touch support in order to make it work well, So definitely look into that closely before committing to setting that up on your build. Baseline Smite pops up next, 3% on day 13, 3% on day 31. However, this is one where there has been some change in the types of builds that are using it. So there's expensive armor stacking champion versions that run Smite. They use Replica Dreamfeather. They are phenomenally strong. These tend to cost a lot to get rolling. There are also cheaper Slayer versions. These are definitely much more accessible. So don't be fooled with the Replica Dreamfeather versions. Just because the defining unique item of the build is really cheap, you are definitely going to need a Mage Blood to play this build. And Mage Blood is probably not going to be in the 5 most expensive items once you've got your build actually finished. After this, we have Molten Strike of the Zenith. This was only about 1% of the meta back on day 13. It's shot up to 3% now. Now this is another one of those cases where the defining item of the build is, if not quite budget, it's at least budget adjacent. Replica Oberon's Warpath costs about 8 to 10 divines at the time I'm recording this video. You look at that and you think, hey, I can afford that. Might have to save up a little bit, but I can definitely get that. But then you look at the rest of the package and you go, I cannot afford this build. This is a very, very, very budget unfriendly build, but it is also very, very strong and tends to be played on the Juggernaut, and it's one of the most tough to kill builds in the entire game. Now, the supporting characters that make the build so expensive, typically you're going to want Nimbus, you're going to want Mage Blood, you're going to want expensive versions of Split Personality, you're going to want Progenesis, and at higher budgets, you're going to want Emperor's Mastery as well, and at the very highest budgets, Sublime Vision and Original Sin. So, definitely not something that is a budget-friendly setup. Generally played as Juggernaut and pretty close to indestructible. And now I want to mention one honorable mention. This doesn't make the list on its own merits. It's only 1% of the meta now, and it was less on day 13. But Eviscerate Ignite as an Elementalist has been something that's a bunch of fun. It can play as Energy Blade, that tends to require a higher budget. It can play as Ephemeral Edge, which can start a little bit earlier. And I'm mentioning this just because it's something I've had a bit of fun with, not because it's a super high power level build. It is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It is a good build, but it's not something that's completely broken or anything of the sort. So if you're looking for something broken, go with something else. But this is something that I've had a lot of fun with so far. The Golem package is amazing, and the Golems stay up a lot longer than I was expecting when I was investigating the new Elementalist. Finally, let's quickly mention some breakout uniques. We've already talked a lot about Whispers of Infinity. This item's incredible. Wine of the Prophet is next. This one is a high budget only item. I actually considered excluding this when I was going through the list of unique items that I wanted to exclude from builds. It's just that people tend to get Mage Blood first, then get Wine of the Prophet afterwards. And so there's a high correlation between people who are playing this flask and who have already got themselves a Mage Blood. Anyway, this is a generic good stuff item. In the way that Headhunter gives you a lot of powerful buffs, you get a lot of power out of it, but you don't have much agency over what that power is. Wine of the Prophet is very similar. It's getting used a lot, it's really strong, and it's the rare item from one of the new Pinnacle bosses. Relikesh's Impatience. The Frenzy Charge edition of this is phenomenal. The Endurance Charge version of it is popular as well, and the Power Charge version, a bit less so because people are usually pretty confident they can get power charges on their build from some other source. Bound by Destiny is getting used a lot more than it was back on day 13, but it's not being used a huge amount, and I think a big part of that is the omens that allow you to guarantee chance an item into a unique. Those have become much more expensive since more people started using Bound by Destiny. Sublime Vision has gone up a lot in popularity over previous leagues. Some versions of it are very expensive, of course, but Sublime Vision is seeing more use than it has in the past. And the last one is a quiet achiever, the Dark Seer. This item is just really good. This item is seeing use on 5% of high-level builds, whereas it was 2 and 3% in Settlers and Freesia respectively. This item's been good since it was given the update. It's just that the player base are starting to pay more attention to it now. Anyways, that's all I got for this update. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results.